Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to our first podcast. I'm Zahra Ali Sayyed, an environmentalist and the founding volunteer of the Green Pilgrim. The Green Pilgrim was formed in 2019 as an advocacy platform to make the pilgrimage to the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala plastic-free. Today, we have turned into a virtual global community of very passionate Husseini volunteers who are taking green actions to transform their religious gatherings, mawqifs, and pilgrimage in general. As an organization, we are constantly in conversation with the stakeholders and policymakers in Iraq, and also with the global community leaders to find sustainable solutions to address the problem of plastic pandemic that the local communities and wildlife of Iraq are facing currently. Today, on the World Environment Day, the urgency of taking green actions for a better future is being highlighted globally. Although our religion, Islam, considers all elements of nature as a sign of Allah Subhanahu wa ta'ala, we rarely talk about the importance of Islamic environmentalism. We are honored today to have Sheikh Jaffer Ladak with us today to discuss the importance of Islamic environmentalism and to highlight the importance of communities in generating a positive environmental impact. Assalamu alaikum, brother. I hope you're well. And thank you for joining.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. I'm honored. Thank you so much for inviting me to such an important, innovative cause. And inshallah, we can actually make a small difference here today, especially on such an internationally celebrated day as well, Environmental Day.
Absolutely. Honor is ours. Let me quickly introduce what wonderful things Sheikh Jaffer Ladak has been doing. Sheikh Jaffer is a UK-based scholar and an environmentalist. His journey towards becoming a scholar started in 2005 when he moved to the holy city of Karbala and joined Jamia Hazatul Muntazir Al-Mahdi Institute in Birmingham, and later the Islamic College in London, from where he completed his master's in Islamic law. Besides his thesis on the themes of Islamic theory of global citizenship, he has authored 4 books and written many articles and research papers. Sheikh Jaffer has also been a resident alim for Islamic centers in London and is the incoming resident alim for Babul Ilm Center in Leeds. As an environmentalist, Sheikh Jaffer has also done some remarkable projects. Especially one project that I really want to highlight is that he's working with a distinguished team of international Islamic scholars to produce a global charter on Islamic environmental ethics, which is due to be presented to the United Nations next year. These are some very amazing things that you're doing, Sheikh Jaffer. We are really proud to have young community leaders like yourself.
Thank you. I'm honored. So some of the work that we're trying to do has been on the ground with different community institutions, the Husseyniyat and the Masajid. But we also need to be able to affect change at an international level. And so I tried to split my time in these 2 ways. So, for example, some of the work that we've been doing on the ground with the communities is that we've been really pushing the agenda of trying to understand the importance of environmental action. So what I've started with different groups is to try to scope out how to be able to deduce where our priorities lie as a community, what we term as the maqasid al-sharia, the goals of the sharia itself. And of course, amongst those is the protection of environment, the protection of life, the sanctity of the planet Earth. And so, for example, with different ABSOCs, universities which have Ahlul Bayt societies, we've started to try to think about the role of Islamic environmentalism as part of their agenda. And of course, even in the Husseyniyat, making sure that communities have a committee that's dedicated towards a green policy. And then there's also been kind of the more international scope. And as you mentioned, one of the things that we're working on is that there's a team of 14 scholars from around the world that have come together to create the first global Islamic charter. And this is actually led by one of the great scholars of our time, Dr. Fazlun Khalid. Anyone who knows anything about environmental activism will know that Dr. Khalid is probably the leading mind in the world when it comes to environmental activism from the Islamic perspective. So we're writing this charter, and inshallah it will then be presented to different jami'at, universities, hawzat, international arenas for their agreement. And then once we have a collaborative effort, we plan to present it to the United Nations. It was actually supposed to be presented this year in Nairobi at one of the upcoming United Nations conferences. But sadly, due to the pandemic, it's been difficult for everyone to travel, to be able to have some of the collaborative work that we'd planned. So it seems to have been pushed back maybe till 2022. With your and all of the mu'mineen's prayers, inshallah, we can have a groundbreaking work that actually pulls together all of the different Muslim institutions around the world for the first time, dedicated to an environmental a document that actually preserves the environmental ethics that are presented from the Quran and Hadith.
That's absolutely brilliant. And I notice a lot of the work that you do is about inspiring communities and the importance of collective action. Why do you so strongly believe in the power of community-led actions?
One voice is easy to drown out. 1,000 voices, 10,000 voices, 1,000,000 voices, it's not so easy to drown out. In fact, it becomes a sweeping tide. What we found in history, for example, is that when you actually have a movement that is like a train, that is an unstoppable force, it actually gathers pace because so many other people realize the relevancy of that matter, and it actually is able to bring about the change at a pace that is much greater than when we do things on our own. The greatest example is the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wa alihi. He managed to change an entire region within 23 years. He didn't do this on his own. He had stakeholders at each level of society. So, for example, if you imagine at the time of the Prophet, there were the youth, there were the aristocrats, there was the political elites, there were the women. And in each place, the Prophet had representatives to help him. Amongst the youth, he had Imam Ali alayhi salam, Abu Dhar. If you needed someone from the kind of the political elite, you had Abu Talib alayhi salam. If you needed presence amongst the sisters, you had Lady Khadija alayhi salam. So he was able to push through change because he had stakeholders in every place that could lead things on his behalf. And I think we need to do this. And this conversation is an example of that. You're based in Karachi, am I correct? Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm in Leeds. Tomorrow you'll have a conversation with someone in New York. You'll have another conversation with someone in Perth. And this is how we actually make a global movement. So congratulations to you for the work that you've started, and all the mu'mineen, inshallah, that wherever this reaches, they hopefully will become part of the Green Pilgrim movement as well.
Inshallah. It is entirely volunteer-led, and I think I had doubts about it, but I think it is mainly because of the community members who came forward, took responsibilities, they had brilliant ideas, and they started transforming whatever they could, whatever was in their power. And we have seen some amazing transformation in the past year, especially during the lockdown when we could not go to the holy cities, but still people were continuing to transform their community centers, gatherings at their houses and homes, and things moved forward from there. Sheikh Jaffer, I would also like to understand your perspective of importance of community centers, especially when we talk about Islamic environmentalism. How can community centers make a difference?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. As we alluded to just a minute ago, individual change is important. However, collective change is more important. And even prior to collective change, systemic change is more important than that. So again, if we go back to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of course he wanted to rescue individual souls and as many individual souls as possible. But actually you needed collective movement, and prior to that you needed systemic change that could then feed into everything the collective did, and then that would feed into what the individuals did. So for example, sadly, of course, we know that there was female infanticide, right? They would kill baby girls en masse. Stopping one person is important. It is necessary. But actually, if you can change it at a systemic level where people understand why something is immoral, why something is moral, then that feeds into the collective practices, and then it changes more individuals. So of course, ayat after ayat after ayat were revealed in order to stop the act of female infanticide. When it comes to our Hussainiyat, sometimes our Hussainiyat, our masajids have 100 people, sometimes they have 5,000 people, sometimes they have 10,000 people. In Karachi, you literally have millions in the community. If leadership, if cultural practices can be changed, then the entire body of people, the jama'at, will actually change their behaviors collectively, and this will feed down into personal practices at home, in the madaris, in the universities, and so on and so forth. So here, when we've tried to target change at the Hussainiyat level, it is trying to bring about systemic change. Now, the problem with that has been, as you will imagine, that sometimes communities are very resistant to change.
Most of the time, yes.
Say again?
Most of the time.
Most of the time, very sadly. And actually, this is part of the problem, because it should be that the Hussainiyya is the model of proper practice. And we'll talk about this in a few minutes' time when we talk about Mecca, Medina, Karbala, Najaf, inshallah.
Yeah.
But the Hussainiyya is not supposed to be based on culture. It is supposed to be based on Islam. Islam is pure. Islam is purifying people. So if the Hussainiyya itself is different to Islam, there is going to be a gap between what is actual Islam and what the people are doing collectively. This gap will potentially widen, and it will also allow people to act improperly, not as per how Islam wants them to act. So when it comes to the Hussainiyya, it is supposed to be reflecting pure Islam first and foremost. Now, when it comes to something like preserving our environment, what we've tried to do here in the UK is try to make systemic change where, when it comes to things like serving food, we want to reduce the amount of meat consumption that we put in our food. Or, for example, we should encourage people to bring their own plates from home, or try to encourage them to bring their own cups for chai. A Hussainiyya may be 100 people, or maybe 5,000 people. If it's 5,000 people, as an example, every week you have the Thursday night program, you have the Friday Jumu'ah program. In the Shi'i community, we have the Wafat programs, the Wilada programs. Every day, every week, we're coming to the mosque and we were providing chai in plastic containers, cups, and every day there would be hundreds, thousands of plastic waste being thrown out. We very quickly realized that this is not proper. We cannot be calling for good environmentalism if the Hussainiyya itself is not leading the way. And so what we try to do is institute policies where people would bring things from home, where people could take responsibility of their own trash, and so on and so forth. For example, when I would go on the pulpit, I would actually bring a cup with me and place it. And I would bring my plate, and I place it on the pulpit, on my seat next to me, so people could see that we're actually leading the way. We're not just saying, you do this, I'm going to lead the way.
Brilliant.
Because sometimes you forget. So I would leave it in the car, and then I'm 10 minutes away from going on the pulpit, and the person reciting the Marthiya or Yasin, and then I had to run out back to my car quickly in order to come and, I'm panting and I'm going up on the pulpit all tired. My point is that you need to be able to lead the way. Everyone who is passionate about this has to lead the way in their practice, and it needs to come with institutional change in the Hussainiyya. Sadly, there was a lot of resistance. A lot of resistance. At times we instituted policies, and 3 days later, literally 3 days later, those policies were pulled because the masses, or at least 10 people, loud voices, sadly in our communities, the loudest voices sometimes have the most sway, even though an empty rattle, rings the loudest. But sadly, the loudest voices were not for some of this change, and they didn't like the idea that we would institute policies of change. They were very resistant, and then sometimes these things were pulled. So we've tried, but my point is that those people who are in leading roles in the organizations have to be able to make the changes, and they have to take the fire and the bullets for them, even if it's going to be difficult. The Prophet did that, and I'm sure you and I will be ready to do that as well.
Absolutely. So we're talking about community centers, and my mind keeps going back to the holy cities, especially from where the Green Pilgrim started, because I've been to Najaf and Karbala more than any other holy cities. So I've noticed that these holy cities of Najaf and Karbala are meeting points of millions of pilgrims who gather from 40 countries and more than 25 cities of Iraq, which means without a doubt, these cities are most powerful platforms for inspiration, knowledge, and change and action in general. How can these religious sites become a center of environmental restoration as well?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. That's a beautiful question. And I think from the perspective of the Green Pilgrim, must remain focused on this central question, because as we stated earlier, if the Husayniyya is going to be the mirror of Islam, by priority, the holy cities of pilgrimage where Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam are, they need to be even more reflective of perfect and proper Islam. Otherwise, if the great cities themselves are not reflective of Islam, where are you expecting Islam to be? Now, there's a verse of the Quran which is really central to this. It is in Surah Al-Hajj, verse number 26. Now, note, of course, we're talking about the most important pilgrimage cities. Hajj and Mecca is the central city in the whole Islamic universe. So the fact that Allah is talking about environmentalism and keeping your location pure and pristine in Hajj, in Surah Al-Hajj, should be sufficient to tell everyone that the importance of this topic. But let's go into the verse and we actually break it down, inshallah. Verse number 26. Allah Subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَإِذْ بَوَّأْنَا لِإِبْرَاهِيمَ مَكَانَ الْبَيْتِ أَنْ لَا تُشْرِكْ بِي شَيْئًا وَطَهِّرْ بَيْتِي. Yeah? So I'm going to break down this verse a little bit just in case people have not thought about this verse. وَإِذْ بَوَّأْنَا لِإِبْرَاهِيمَ مَكَانَ الْبَيْتِ. Right? We assigned to Ibrahim alayhi salam the site of the house. Now, what's really interesting here is that in modern day Islamic sciences, both Shia and Sunni, the word for environment is bi'ah. Yeah? So we will say fiqh al-bi'ah, the fiqh of environment, for example. وَإِذْ بَوَّأْنَا لِإِبْرَاهِيمَ مَكَانَ الْبَيْتِ, the Quran says. Bawa'na, the root is bi'ah, meaning we settled, we placed. Bi'ah is meaning environment, but it means a place of settling. Yeah, the two words here are synonymous with each other. Allah says, وَإِذْ بَوَّأْنَا لِإِبْرَاهِيمَ مَكَانَ الْبَيْتِ. We settled in the environment, the location for Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, makan al-bayt, the site of the house. And we all know that this is Baytullah, the Kaaba. And la tushrik bi shay'a. What's the first thing that Ibrahim alayhi salam is supposed to do at the house of Allah? Not to do any sort of polytheism, not to associate anything with Allah. And then number two, وَطَهِّرْ بَيْتِي. Purify my house.
Subhanallah.
Amazing, because the word tahir, tahara, purification, it is itlaq, it is mutlaq, it has absolute meaning, it is completely comprehensive. So whatever meaning is justifiably within it, it is correct. So from one perspective, tahir bayti, purify my house, make sure that there is no shirk. From the other perspective, purify my house, purify from all types of dhulm and oppression, all types of exploitation, purify from anything that reduces its pristine nature. Now, this tells us that from the outset of the godly movement of God's house on earth, Ibrahim alayhi salam was told to make sure that Allah's house was perfectly pure, perfectly pristine, perfectly balanced. Now, if that's supposed to be, then we know what Medina al-Munawwara is supposed to be. We know what Najaf al-Ashraf is supposed to be. We know what Karbala al-Muqaddasa is supposed to be. Ought to be, Tahir bayti, purify my house. So from this, what my humble reflection is, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala is telling us that these great locations of worship, of gathering, of pilgrimage, has to be perfectly pure, representative of Islam. And when it's not, Allah makes this command, وَطَهِّرْ بَيْتِي, purify my house. Now, this is where the Green Pilgrim's work comes in, because I've been watching it, and I know we've been in conversation here and there, and it's such an important movement. If we can get our cities to be restored back to being examples of Islam, then actually it is easier for us to be able to call upon our Husseyniyat to make institutional change, households to do institutional change. Whereas if the pilgrim cities and the atabat and the actual haram of Imam alayhi salam is not in line with Islamic values, then what hope do we have? For example, on the walk, if there's so much plastic wastage, on the walk, if you see that there is not trees being planted, on the walk, when you go towards the river Furat and you see it's just become a dumping ground, what hope does Islam have to be a leader for the world? What hope do these pilgrimage cities have to being leaders of the world if we can't even fix our own house properly, if our house has become a dumping ground? And this is where the Green Pilgrim movement becomes so important. So to reiterate, Allah has told us to purify his houses. And I think that we need to think seriously about what this means in our own times.
So we've been talking about collective action. As individuals, there are some very simple steps that we can take. Because sometimes it's hard to convince communities or a group of people or to make a sustainable policy change. But there are so many things that we can do individually as well, especially as pilgrims of Imam Hussein alayhi salam, because these holy cities are blessing us with everything that we desire and that we seek. But then what do we leave behind? So there's a sense of accountability of our actions. So what advice would you give to pilgrims when they are planning their visits to the holy cities? How can they be green pilgrims?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The most important thing that a person can do, in my humble opinion, is to take account of their ziyarah in more ways than what is traditionally being asked of people. When we imagine ziyarah, we normally understand it in the context of the a'mal that is recommended for us. We have to make sure that we do our idhn dukhul. We want to make sure that we participate in these great a'mal that is there. And of course, this is the central piece of the ziyarat of Imam al-Hussein or Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen or the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But actually today, ziyarah has to become much more than just the rituals that we have been inheriting. Part of our spiritual presence in front of the Imam has to be the taking of account of our impact upon the environment, upon the people that we are participating with, and whether we are actually causing harm along the route of that journey. Because if we were creating harm and damage to people and environment and animals and everything else on the route, I wonder how Imam will welcome us when we actually arrive at his blessed sanctuary and his darih. We hold on to it and we kiss it and we say, Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. How will the Imam alayhi salam respond to me if I had been causing damage to his people or to the world itself? Now, with that in mind, we have to think about the concept of iqtisad versus asraf. We all know what asraf is, right? It's a type of waste. It is a type of imbalance and a lack of preservation of the rights of my own wealth, of my own material belongings, and ultimately I use it in such a way that is unbefitting of me being a Shia of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. The opposite of asraf is iqtisad, which is balance, which is moderation, which is preservation in everything that we do. And we can actually start thinking about, from the very beginning of our movement, of our ziyarah, about our own consumption and our own carbon footprint, and along the journey, our own consumption and waste and carbon footprint. So, for example, if I'm traveling from London to Istanbul, Istanbul to Najaf, Najaf to Qadmain, Samarra, Karbala, I have my hotel stays, I have my meals. Actually, there is a cumulative CO2 output that has been generated. And it is very easy for me to calculate this with the flights, the food consumption, the wastage. Websites will do this for you now. And the person needs to be cognizant of how much they are using, when they could have more of an iqtisad, more of a balance, when they can remove asraf and wastage along their journey, and thinking about what they can do to offset that particular generated amount of gases or CO2 consumption that they have been using. I think this is one thing that we need to build into the model of ziyarah very, very quickly, into the model of Hajj that we are doing very, very quickly. And I think that if individuals start to think about this and push community leaders, ziyarah groups, ziyarah heads to be able to incorporate this into the price, into the ethics of their program for their Hajj and ziyarah tours, then I think we'll be able to make a big difference institutionally, systemically, the way in which people actually perform the ziyarah.
Absolutely. That's very well said. And, you know, when we were doing a little survey for the Green Pilgrims 2 years back, what I realized is just if you carry one reusable bottle, you can avoid 100 plastic cups during your 10-day stay, which will decompose not before 400 years. So that's a big environmental impact that, you know, as individuals, we are constantly generating. And we can turn it into a positive impact very easily just by carrying a reusable bottle with us.
And if you imagine how many millions of pilgrims there are, that accounts for so much plastic. You know, 5 million, 10 million pilgrims at 100 cups each. It is a baffling number.
It's exactly. Back in 2019, there were 60 million pilgrims who visited these two holy cities. So just imagine the plastic use was in billions. You know, the plastic cups that would decompose. And now, and the local population also uses
our masks as well. And these masks are thrown away. And people are going through hundreds of masks a year.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a very alarming situation, and the urgency of taking green actions is very, very, you know, it's very important that we start thinking about making an impact now. To conclude our discussion, I would really like to learn from you. What are some points that you would recommend for community centers, or for individuals to practice for a better, greener future?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We have to go back to the science, and we have to be able to note how the science is telling us where the biggest impacts of our environmental impacts are. Now, some of these may be very difficult for people to appreciate because we have built a lifestyle, and sometimes to change your lifestyle is very tough for people. But you can imagine the lifestyle that people were living at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he asked them to make huge changes, to go away from haram completely to opposite ways of living. Here we're only asking for slight changes in personal and collective behaviors. For example, according to the science, one of the greatest outputs for CO2 emissions is the consumption of meat. So when we consume meat, of course, that meat has to be grown. So these animals need to be able to take food, take water, be housed, be sheltered. What we have to realize is that this entire process and the methane that is produced by these animals is actually arguably the single greatest contributor to the problem of CO2 gases and the reason why we have global warming. Now, from the Islamic perspective, consuming a lot of meat is actually highly, highly makruh. The Prophet ﷺ would consume meat once every 40 days, as an example, according to a very famous set of traditions. Even then, we actually have a hadith where Ahlul Bayt alayhimussalam prohibited, made haram, certain types of meats that were halal temporarily because it was becoming a damage to them. So, for example, you actually have some meats like camels and others, it was halal. But Ahlul Bayt alayhimussalam prohibited because they needed to preserve these particular animals because war was going to occur. Now imagine what I'm saying. Ahlul Bayt alayhimussalam made haram temporarily certain types of meats to preserve something. Similarly, in our day, we can think about the heavy reduction of meat consumption in order to be able to preserve our environment. Now, anyone who wants these ahadith, we can send it to them. Feel free to get in contact. But I think these are the honest conversations that we need to be having with our communities about the reduction of meat consumption. This may be difficult for personal behaviors, but this is one thing that we can do. Secondly, the second biggest or amongst the gravest reasons why there is environmental challenges is, for example, the heating that we have on. The heating up to a certain level, when it's wastage in the summer, we don't need it. These things actually contribute very highly to the CO2 emissions that is causing the type of environmental problems that we are facing. So again, small things like just being able to turn down the heating, the amount of things that we use, the electricity, turning electricity off when we don't need to be able to use it. All these sorts of things can make minor changes within our communities. Go into any mosque, go into any Husseiniya, and I challenge you. You will see the lighting always on. You will see that the switches are always on, draining electricity even though it's not being used. Small changes we can do in our personal behaviors in order to ensure that we don't continue waste. Second. Third, and lastly, what we need to really think about is our own personal asraf. Food wastage is one of the big challenges that we have. Okay. Anywhere up to 30 or 40% of food is often going to waste in houses across the world. There are people in other parts of the world, they don't have even the basics of food. And because we purchase so much and we consume so much and we waste so much, the output that is being created is so high and that there is a gap between the creation and the needs that people have. And actually, if we thought better about redistribution of this, people around the world would actually get food, and we would not need to waste so much. All of these things go into our personal CO2 types of, or the personal footprint, the carbon footprint that we have. These are three things that we can do individually. Last thing is that we actually need to do things systemically. As much change you and I personally make, it is almost insignificant. And I mean that. You and I can become, reduce our asraf. We can make sure that we switch off the lights when we don't need them. It will make a minor difference. What we need to think about is systemic global difference. There needs to be, at the global level, at the level of governments, there needs to be global public policy, which looks at the behaviors and the laws that corporations have to work within. There needs to be a framework at the global level that ensures all corporations start following a model of sustainability, not that it is in their best interests as a corporation, that it is in the interest of humanity at large. If we can push for this, then inshallah, we will actually see change over the next amount of time that helps us to be able to stave off the dangers that we have in regards to the pollutions and the environmental damage that is upon us. Inshallah, we can all do our bit towards these different areas.
Thank you so much. That was beautifully said. And just want to add, while listening to these 3 points that you shared, I remember that when I was doing my initial survey about the seriousness of plastic waste during our pilgrimage, I used to sit with women coming from different parts of the world in the Holy Shrine, strangers, complete strangers. I would just start a conversation with them and see what they've been observing. So food wastage has been one of the very important topics that everyone notices, no matter from which country they arrive in the holy cities. But food wastage is a serious problem. And even within the holy cities, there are people who do not have enough food to eat. And we as pilgrims waste so much food. These are some topics that people are not really willing to accept, acknowledge, or talk about. So I'm very glad that we had this conversation and you highlighted all these very valid points. We must really consider ourselves accountable for all the food wastage. Even as Muslims, we are answerable to whatever we are wasting, whatever we're using more than we need. So I'm very glad we had this conversation. Once again, thank you so much for being here and for inspiring us. Your work is remarkable, and I'm really looking forward to see the changes that you're going to make globally, especially through your Islamic Environmental Ethics Charter that you're going to present next year. So all the best for that. Thank you for being here.
And to you as well. Well done with your work. And inshallah, you'll be able to make the changes systemically that we need across the pilgrimage cities.
Together, we'll make this change, inshallah. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for watching.